Hello everyone. Welcome back to another SCP Resurrection reading. We would be starting off today by reading Part 2-1, Operation Canned Granada by Dr. Clef and Foggy Golem, but I accidentally read that back when we were reading number 1 with a bullet, not realizing it would come up later. So, imagine that went between this video and the last one, and instead, next we'll be reading Part 2-2, Folly by DJ Cactus. Now, without further ado, let us begin. Folly. I was once assigned to SCP-058, Carlisle said. Back then, it would rage throughout the day, and the walls of the containment cage would bend until they would buckle and break, and new walls would be erected. There was talk of a possible breach, that they could not keep up with the beast indefinitely. There was discussion of terminating it. I was asked to intervene because of work I had done elsewhere. In this instance, I took a direct approach to the creature. What best can sedate it? One who only functions to eviscerate all that it can perceive. So, I visited the site where it was held, and suggested they offer it a cow. Documentation describes this behavior as feeding, but it is not exact. No, the creature only desires mutilation. We offer the creature a cow, something it is capable of mutilating, with no detrimental effect to our staff. We fine-tuned this mechanism over time. At first, it was cow every day. This proved to be too often. The bloodlust of the creature would whip it into a frenzy. Additional cow would only make the creature more destructive. So, we make the creature wait. Condition it to expect cow every other day, then 3. Soon the creature spends its time waiting, knowing the moment will come. We have struck a balance with the creature. An exchange has been made. The creature is now controlled. Shirley Gillespie nodded slowly. The creature could be trained. Carlisle smiled. The creature could be utilized. It is done then. We are set on our path. Carlisle studied the message he had received that morning. The results of council votes were a secret, known only to those most directly affected. He had been surprised when he had received this one, before realizing it would have been strange if he hadn't. It is, Joshua said. He stood in the shadow of Carlisle's office at Site 19, silent but a few words. The vote concluded last night. You were there? No, that was not part of my assignment. Carlisle raised his eyes. Very well. I assume this to mean that we have a new assignment then. Joshua nodded. You do not seem overly enthused with the council's decision. Joshua was a blank slate, but Carlisle had learned to read where the lines had once been. Is there something bothering you, Joshua? Joshua's eyes cut across the room like a saber. No, the actions of the council are my actions. All that matters is the objective. And yet, I received this notice early in the morning. You did not arrive until afternoon, and I have never known you to be late. You were not with the council during their vote, yes? You have not informed me of any other assignments, and I believe that I am your only. So where else would you be? Carlisle could feel the heat off of him, even from across the room. I am assigned only to ensure your safety, and make sure that you complete your assignment, Joshua said. Even after all these years, do not think I cannot still read you, brother, Carlisle said, his spine tingling as he saw Joshua's eyes tighten. I have known you for too long. Joshua lingered a moment more, and then he was gone. Carlisle examined the paper in his hand for a moment more, and then began to gather his belongings. I don't care for it, Carlisle, Shirley Gillespie said. 1,000 miles away, her voice crackled through the telephone. It's very poorly understood. Every SCP is poorly understood, Director, Carlisle said, rubbing his temples and attempting to ignore the jolting pain in his back whenever the vehicle he was in struck a hole. That is why they're SCPs. Even still,
There's a potential danger here that you may not be ready for. What happens when it isn't what you're expecting it to be?
Then I have Joshua.
Shirley made a sound in the back of her throat. Right. Trusting the safety of one of the Foundation's top doctors to some mercenary fool that the Council dug up. Wonderful.
Carlyle smiled despite himself. I am not concerned, Shirley. Neither should you be. You remembered the time we spoke about SCP-058?
I do?
Then you will remember what I said then. Even animals can be understood and controlled. But Pan-Hun is no animal. Indeed, it is by all accounts a human being, and human beings are capable of reason and intellect.
Carlyle, it leveled a small town.
Yes, that is what we are told. Perhaps it is no different than any other humanoid entity, powerful beyond its own control and afraid, likely to lash out at those it does not understand. Who knows what it is capable of? Can you see the potential that might pose for Alpha 9?
Fine. I'll forward you all the information I have on the entity, but that's all the help you'll be getting from me today. I had better not hear about you dying Actus, or I'll be upset with you.
Carlyle nodded. I will hold you to it. A plane took Carlyle to Site 23 on the Hudson Bay, and then it shipped him to SCP-1864. Joshua was already on the docks when he arrived, and he escorted Carlyle to a Foundation encampment outside the entrance to a anomaly proper. Director, welcome to SCP-1864. The man who greeted them was in his 50s with graying hair and neatly groomed goatee. His jacket identified him as Tom Bradford, Doctor. Dr. Bradford, Carlyle said, extending a hand. Thank you for meeting me. We have much to discuss. The two entered a tent that provided a meager reprieve from the storm surging across the bay. On the walls were various printed readouts and images. Carlyle stopped to investigate one, a depth reading of something within the anomaly. The result of the test was inconclusive. I don't know what you're doing here, Director, Bradford said, pouring a cup of coffee. I was unaware they sent site directors to check up on remote dangerous skips now. Carlyle smiled. This is not a typical checkup, I'm afraid. There has been an incident recently, which has expedited the need for such visits, and I just so happen to be passing through. He took the coffee as Bradford handed it to him. I do hope that I am not causing a disturbance. Not at all. What exactly are you looking to do while you're here? Carlyle handed him an envelope. The classification committee is regularly charged with examinations of safe and Euclid class entities to determine if their classifications require reevaluation. Bradford squinted at the paper now in his hands. Is there not somebody you could have sent in your place? This seems like an awful lot of trouble for you. The examination was expedited, Carlyle said again, his face unwavering. There really is no time to waste. The other doctor flipped through the pages quickly and then shrugged. Fair enough. My boys will get you in to see it, and they'll get you out. Not sure if this is the best time, though. Dr. Boff has been a little agitated lately. Carlyle nodded. I have no doubt that this will be nothing more than routine, Doctor. A security team carried Carlyle into the depths of the SCP-1864 labyrinth on the back of a transportation vehicle. Joshua had not been with them when they departed, but every so often Carlyle would catch a glimpse of him, barely visible in the darkness, following closely behind them. As they rounded the final corner, the vehicle stopped and Carlyle disembarked. We're gonna pull back to the 100-meter point, one of the security agents said. Our orders are to hang back there until we hear from you. If anything happens, start running. Carlyle gave his thanks and made the final length of the journey himself, which put him within a large carved stone chamber. In the center was a pool of dark water, and across from him was what at one point had been a human being, but was now SCP-1864-1. Guten Tag, Dr. Boff,
Carlyle said, his accent slipping through the new language like a glove.
My name is Dr. Actus. I am with the Foundation.
The face of the hulking, rooted half-human twisted into what might be described as a smile. It slowly ambled across the room towards him, its singular, long-coiled arm extended in a greeting.
It is good to see a fellow scientist again,
Dr. Boff said, his words eternally muffled behind his impeded jaw.
So often I only see agents with their guns. Rarely do I see researchers anymore.
Unfortunate indeed. Carlyle made note of his surroundings, his eyes catching Joshua hidden within a shadow to his left. Perhaps we will make amends for the absence today, Doctor. Boff nodded his grizzled head.
Let us hope. What is it that brings you to me today, Herr Actus?
Carlyle motioned towards the pool of water. I was hoping to speak to SCP-1864-2, Dr. Boff. Boff's expression sharpened, his eyes slanting and his hackles raising.
Pan Hun,
he spat. Yes, Pan Hun. Carlyle kept one eye on Dr. Boff's arm, which swung idly and dangerously overhead. There has been a change, Doctor. The world is growing more dangerous every day, and our leaders seek the challenge this danger by...
Challenge it?
Dr. Boff laughed timidly.
I do not understand. I feel as though there is little of value for you here, for such an endeavor.
A task force, Dr. Boff, Carlyle said. For some time now, our administrators have been assembling anomalous entities which we could implement against the dangers that threaten our world. I am a member of the group attempting to identify which entities would best suit...
Oh, no, Doctor,
Boff said, his smile wavering and his eyes growing tight.
I understand now, yes, but I must insist there is nothing that will aid you here.
Carlyle sighed. It is the belief of our administrators that SCP-1864 might be intelligent, reasonable, and possibly misunderstood. We have encountered a number of seemingly hostile anomalous entities who simply were not capable of controlling themselves and meant no harm to others. We believe that a chance to speak to Pan Hun might reveal its true intentions, and if they are benign, perhaps it would be excited at the chance to leave its prison in order to keep the world safe, and... Dr. Boff reared back and away from Carlyle, his arms slamming against the side walls of the chamber.
You think this was a misunderstanding? You wish to make the world safe by releasing Pan Hun?
Not necessarily, no, Carlyle said, adjusting his glasses. We have become very good at containing dangerous entities, Doctor. If we discover Pan Hun is truly hostile, then we have other ways to manage it. Our goal is to utilize the anomalous traits of SCP-1864-2 if possible, in order to better prepare for something worse.
Something worse? You think there is something worse?
Dr. Boff roared, his body flailing and writhing against the chamber. Carlyle took a step back to steady himself, carefully looking for an opportunity to get a word in edgewise against the torrent of insults in German that now flowed freely from Boff. Before he could make his case, Joshua appeared beside him.
Joshua,
Boff said, his body immediately and noticeably growing tense. Carlyle peered into Boff's wild eyes and saw recognition there. Why would Dr. Boff know who Joshua is? You must allow Dr. Actus to see Pan Hun, Dr. Boff. Joshua's voice was cold and controlled. It is the will of the overseers. Boff hesitated, carefully eyeing Joshua with his distorted gaze. Beads of sweat began to form on his brow, and his eyes shifted frantically between Carlyle and Joshua. Finally, Boff sighed.
I will not be able to keep you both safe,
Boff said. You won't have to, Joshua replied. Boff nodded, and with a single motion, his long curled arm began to descend quickly into the pool of water before them. It continued to descend long after Carlyle thought that the pool, or Boff's arm, would run out, and then longer still. Finally, it stopped and began to pull back out of the pool. With it came a head of black hair, and then a body. Pan Hun looked, by all measures, to be a normal human child, Asian descent, light skin, no older than 8 or 9 years of age. Carlyle studied the body as Boff laid it on the stone floor, noting that Boff would not take his hand off of Pan Hun's neck. There was a moment of silence, and then Pan Hun opened its eyes. They were dark, and Carlyle was careful to avert his gaze slightly before his own dark glasses. The words sent a chill through Carlyle's body. "Hello, SCP-1864-2, Carlyle said. "You are familiar with me?" "I am familiar with a great many things, Director." Carlyle nodded slowly. "Then you are aware of the nature of your containment?" Pan Hun's eyes rolled back in its head, and its neck twisted backwards until it was staring at Dr. Boff. "Oh yes, the pit. Very clever. Dr. Boff has done a wonderful job. He is, after all, at the top of his field." At the sound of his own name, Boff's grip on Pan Hun tightened slightly. "Good," Carlyle said. "I'm here today because—" Pan Hun's head jerked back to face Carlyle, its smile undiminished. "I know why you're here. Director Jean Carlyle Actus, Site 81 SCP Foundation, son of Anna and Gregory, brother to Jeremiah," and its eyes flicked sideways as it trailed off. "The pit is dark, but all manner of words echo within it. It is one of those places in the world that sits between and beneath things." "Very well then," Carlyle said, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. "Would you be willing to participate in a preliminary examination to determine the extent of your abilities?" Pan Hun's eyes darted back towards Carlyle, but then rolled sideways to look at Joshua. "This one should have told you, I think," the voice hissed. "Told you about the dark things in the world and what happens when you pick at them like a scab." Carlyle glanced sideways at Joshua, who, despite being seemingly unmoved, had at some point moved his hand to rest on his weapon. Pan Hun continued. "You are so certain of that because you are capable of dragging the Assyrian into the light and making him dance for a short time that you can do the same with all the toys in your boxes." His wide smile grew wider, and Carlyle could see the corners of his mouth beginning to tear. "I think you will find that many of those toys are not as nice as Abel, Doctor." Carlyle grimaced. "I take that as your unwillingness to move forward, then." Pan Hun's eyes locked on Carlyle. "You know, we are not so different, Carlyle. Both of us are bound to systems we did not choose to be in, but regardless, ended up here due to our own actions. Both of us have lived longer than any might have expected given our circumstances. I wonder how you would feel if somebody showed up and asked if you wanted to play puppet for your overseers." "Dr. Boff," Joshua said, his voice a hiss, "I believe we're done here." Pan Hun's face grew still, the smile gone. "Oh no. You asked for a demonstration and you will have it." The growing feeling of discomfort in Carlyle's stomach suddenly erupted into agony. Carlyle collapsed to the ground, screaming. Without a word, Joshua pulled his weapon, but found his hands had grown over the trigger and were useless. He called out to Buff in German, and the doctor roared in fury. Pan Hun seemed to grow larger, expanding by way of dozens of long, wet appendages that appeared all over his body. Boff squeezed tight around the creature's neck as it flailed at him, and with a crack, he whipped Pan Hun into the ceiling with a flick of his massive arm. The sound of the child striking the ceiling ran out like a gunshot, and was followed by the sound of something vile crawling out of Carlyle's stomach. It was humanoid, but too fleshy and lacking in facial features. Carlyle opened his mouth and eyes long enough to see it and cry out before collapsing entirely in a pool of his own blood. The creature within him dragged the rest of itself from the doctor and turned to face Joshua. With Boff swinging Pan Hun wildly into the walls of the cavern, and the creature quickly closing its distance, Joshua reached down and began to tear away at the extra flesh over his hands with his teeth. He backed slowly, keeping one eye on the flesh beast and another on his own viscera. He spat the chunks of his hand onto the ground and continued to dig until he felt the sensation of steel on his tongue. Joshua brought the weapon to his face and steadied his aim. The creature raised its arms just as Joshua distended his mouth wide enough to fit around the accessible trigger of the gun. He hesitated for a second and then two until he could feel the heat of the creature's body against his own, and then he bit down. A hole opened where the monster's head had been, and Joshua heard the satisfying gurgle of blood and air mixing. A normal man might have found the recoil enough to shatter his teeth and mutilated his jaw, but Joshua was no normal man. He bit down again, and the creature fell to the ground. Joshua lifted his foot and then drove it through the humanoid's torso with a sound like a popping of a balloon full of paint. He turned then to Boff, who was losing his struggle with the child in his grasp. Lacerations covered his already twisted form, and Pan Hun continued to strike and slice the flesh of the doctor, who groaned in pain. Joshua took 2 steps forward, pulled his weapon to his face again, and bit down on the open trigger. Pan Hun screamed as his torso exploded and his legs fell limp. Joshua took another step forward and fired again, this time splitting the child's face in 2. Pan Hun turned a single working eye towards Joshua and lashed at him with a black, fleshy appendage. Joshua caught it in his mouth and lunged backwards, tearing it off and causing Pan Hun to murmur out in agony. Joshua spat it clear of his mouth of gore and shouted at Boff to move Pan Hun closer. The doctor complied, and soon the ruptured body of the lonely liar hung before Joshua like a marionette. He studied the writhing creature for a moment and then leaned in to face it directly. "There is a hole in this world much darker than the one you have been rotting in," he said, blood dripping from his open mouth, "and do not think I'm above burying you in it." He saw panic creep into Pan Hun's eyes. "You know the one, the sanctuary of sundered hearts. There will be nothing for you to twist there in the darkness." Boff's eyes glazed over, and he began speaking in Pan Hun's voice. "What is it you desire?" Joshua nodded at Carlisle and Boff. "Undo your twisting, or I will put another shell in you now and let you bleed all the way to the door. When you are done, return to your pit and stay there until the stars go out." Pan Hun's single eye raged with silent violence, but dimmed. The lacerations on Boff's body closed and sealed, and Joshua began to hear Carlisle breathing again behind him. He nodded to Boff, who began to lower the child back into the pit of water. As it sunk, Joshua gazed at Pan Hun and smiled coldly. "You were right about there being less kind monsters in the world than able, liar," Joshua said, malice creeping into his voice. "It is a shame you had to meet one so soon." Pan Hun glared at him as it slipped below the surface of the pool and watched him until it disappeared from sight in the darkness of the deep. Hours later, the security team emerged and Carlisle was moved quickly to the infirmary. His eyes glazed over as they were opened for a moment to see Joshua staring down at him. Carlisle's body shook as he tried to make words, but he slipped in and out of consciousness, unable to finish. As his old body began to give out, and as medical personnel swarmed him, Carlisle watched Joshua disappear behind a flap in the tent. He distantly heard the sound of a phone being dialed in Joshua's muted voice again, and Carlisle tried to call out to him. A mask was placed over his face, and the world went black. And that is the end of our reading today. Thank you very much for coming. I rather enjoyed reading that one. I do enjoy Joshua, but that's where it's going to end today. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you all in the future.